junctures from Liverpool, England.
People all over the world are just beginning to talk about the Beatles.
My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were four very talented guys.
1, 2, 3.
Hello, my name's Paul McCartney.
This is Ringo Starr. This is John Lennon.
I'm George Harrison.
Welcome back to a very special episode of the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Today, I'd like to welcome back on the podcast three crowd favorite guests, Josh Turner, Tomo Fujita, and David Bennett. For the first time ever, all four of us are going to discuss in depth one of our favorite bands of all time, the Beatles. But this time around, we're not only going to discuss their influence on us, we're actually going to take a deep dive into their music. That means we're going to talk about our favorite Beatles eras and albums, what makes their music so great, if they really were good musicians at a technical level, George Martin's contributions to their music, what we think of their final single Now and Then, and the use of artificial intelligence in their music, and so much more. Thank you all for listening to this episode and to every episode that was released this year. If this is your first time listening, be sure to follow this podcast so you can keep up to date with all of our new episodes. And if you are not subscribed to Josh, Tomo, or David's YouTube channels yet, I've included the links to their respective channels in the podcast description, so please be sure to subscribe to them. They're some of my favorite musicians and creators out there. And with that being said, let's jump into the episode.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey guys, thank you all so much for coming back on the podcast again. I'm so excited for today's conversation because we're going to be talking all about the music of the Beatles and the things that make it so great and timeless. So let's start off the conversation today with a simple but hard to answer question, and eventually we'll dive a little deeper. Josh, can you start us off by telling us what is your favorite Beatles album or era and why?
So what you sent some of these questions in advance, and I was actually just the other day pondering this question and thinking about how I don't really have a satisfactory answer to it. Maybe I think my favorite Beatles album tends to change with the season of life that I'm in to a certain extent, I think. But the first one that I discovered, and the one that I would say I come back to the most often, is probably Abbey Road. Yeah, I almost feel like that's like an underdog pick because I think a lot of people tend to look to their more the time periods when they were more in change or when they were getting along together as a band and so on. Because in some ways, Abbey Road was kind of like an epitaph, in terms of where they were in their career. But I don't know. There was just something about that one from the time I was a single-digit age that album just feels like it's carved out of a single piece of marble to me. Like it's just perfect in every regard. It took the whole world of songwriting and producing and engineering and stuff, a decade to catch up with it. It feels like so. Yeah, it does tend to change, but if I had to give my most frequent answer over the years, it would be Abbey Road. I also have a great fondness for the sort of like 66 to 67 time period when they were really moving like from Revolver into the psychedelia type stuff, and I think they released a lot of their strongest and most interesting singles during that time period. But as an album, Abbey Road.
So I have to ask, what did you think of Maxwell's Silver Hammer?
I mean, it's goofy, but on an album that also contains I Want You, She's So Heavy, like you kind of need a Maxwell Silver Hammer. Like, I think that's just like, it's part of it. It helps establish equilibrium, It's the same with Octopus's Garden, But also, like, I'm just, as I mentioned the last time I was lucky enough to chat with you, I'm just a Paul fan for life, and so my tolerance for the silliness factor is very high.
Me too. I'm 100% on the same page. Tomo, how about you? What is your favorite Beatles album or era?
Yes. First of all, I'm from Japan originally, came to United States. And when I was in Japan, we all listened to Beatles like compilation. That was really popular. Blue Album and Red Album, or White Album. Those three are really popular in Japan. And I was, checking FM and I just, listened to these songs. But eventually I realized like this album, Magical Mystery Tour, when I heard this one, it's something really, really changed. Of course, I like early album, but this one really has a big impression that having a rock band has a strength in it. And when I was a kid, I was like only 12 listening to this, and I thought really different. And I like the old album too, just like Jack said, I mean, so many is great, but that was really made me wow, the band, you know. So a lot of great impression on the album.
I agree. I mean, one of my favorite things about Magical Mystery Tour, and part of what I think makes it so good, is the fact that, like, creatively, they were still at their peak, but the pressure from Sgt. Pepper and having to release what was marketed as like the best album of the century, all of that pressure was off,
Yeah.
and they had time to make some songs that were really fun and carefree. So I definitely appreciate that aspect of that album as well.
Wow. That's great. Great way to put it. Yeah.
David, what about you? What's your favorite album or era?
I always go for Sergeant Pepper, but I'm glad that you said an era rather than album, because I think it's so often the best songs, one way or another, didn't actually wind up on the album. And for me, my absolute favorite Beatles track, anything track, is Strawberry Fields Forever, which was, I think, the first track they recorded for Sergeant Pepper, but then eventually got released separately because they wanted to release a single, and then it wound up on Magical Mystery Tour. So yeah, that era when they were at the height of their powers in consideration to like getting the studio to sound weird and in ways that had never been done before. That's the era I love. So Strawberry Fields, but also things like I Am the Walrus, which is yet another song that's not on Sergeant Pepper, but feels like it's in that era of what they were doing.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. And I think one of the coolest things about Strawberry Fields is how it progressed from John's original acoustic demo to the finished studio product. I mean,
Yeah.
it really makes you appreciate their creativity within the studio.
Definitely. It's almost a perfect example of how they used the studio as sort of an instrument, because that song, just if you had a acoustic guitar and just played it, it would be totally different.
Oh yeah, it really would be. And, I think that's a great segue into the next topic that I'd like to discuss with you guys. So I'm wondering, in which aspect of the Beatles' musical or career progression is their growth as artists most evident? And I mean this in a way of, like, if we compare their chord progressions or instrument choices in their earlier songs to their later ones, or anything along those lines, how do you think that their progression is the most evident?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, I think that it's tempting to say the songwriting just because, they progressed from I Want to Hold Your Hand to, much more complicated, nuanced, emotional experiences. But then again, they also kind of came full circle. And they and like just like writing love songs for all of them, honestly, was such a through line that I think that it developed and it matured, but it actually didn't change all that much over the years. I mean, I think that just the way that the things sound, obviously, is another huge part of it. Just the fidelity of the recordings and the density of the arrangements and so on. And part of that is attributable to just the march of technology, because obviously the 60s, you span a huge kind of divide in the history of recording, where you've got the hyper literal, like, one track tape era of the 50s, and then, all the way up into the multi-track extravaganza of the 70s. And I guess they were kind of in conversation with that, right? Because they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with recording, but then they were also responding to what was becoming available. So I think that it's just the sonic, like, for lack of a better term, like the sonic textures that they were going for. I think the level of fearlessness that they had is what maybe changed the most. I think that they started out as a rock band and they were doing the rock band thing. They were playing covers. They were doing what a lot of their peers were doing. And one of the things that's just so amazing about the arc of their career is that rather than, as their fame grew, it wasn't like, oh shoot, we better just do what we did on the last album, because what if it's a flop, right? It was just like, what's an even weirder thing we can do? What's a way we can push ourselves even further? I think that's the way that they develop the most over time, is just finding new and stranger ways to grow. And even I think that you can even fit Let It Be into that narrative, because I think that by the time it got to 1969, 1970, one of the scariest things that they could do was just go back to being basically a 4-member band performing live takes of things, because they had gotten so far from that in the past 4 years. So yeah, I guess if I were to sum it up, fearlessness, I think that's the thing that developed the most over time.
Well, overall, like every song to me, it's just chord progression, harmony is so rich compared to any other band. And like Josh said, from 50s to 60s, then they use multi-track recording and really effectively making a lot of different, effect, sound, arrangement. But still, to me, like chord progression with Yesterday, that's a lot of quality in 2 minutes. That's really amazing. Especially, I am an instrumental guitar player, tend to play a little longer song, and so I always love to hear Beatles and Late Night and really think 2 minutes and you can really tell the story. And just and plus, to me, keep continuing to write many songs and more. And my wild guess is they are in England thinking about, okay, we'll play like a blues like American people, but we can't do it well. So let's make more original song, Maybe that's how they kept doing it, but great way.
For me, I think the thing that made the Beatles so special is how they used the studio. And you can see that so vividly when you look at 1966, when they did their final tour. And even to quit touring and focus on being a studio band was unprecedented. And, Brian Epstein thought this was the end of the Beatles, but actually it was kind of just the beginning. And nowadays, I think new fans of the Beatles are actually drawn more to that post 66 music, where it gets just so wildly creative so quickly, because they're no longer thinking in the same way that every band has ever thought, like, how are we going to perform this on stage? They're just thinking, we're going to make music for music's sake and just make it as wild as possible. And, looking at Revolver, a year before with Help, it's just like day and night. And it's just unbelievable the sudden change that they had in that moment.
Do you think that it was a scary decision to make for the Beatles to stop touring and start making music that was completely different than what they've been making before?
I think they they experienced so much in that initial run that they had, however many years it was, 2 or 3 years of intense touring, intense publicity, and they already had enough money. They already were tired of the game. People were talking in terms of rock and roll being a passing fad. I think they just thought, screw it. I don't want to be doing this anymore. Let's just do what we want and just see what happens. And the boldness of that decision is what made the Beatles not just a great band that came and went in the 60s, but a timeless band that will now last, forever.
Yes. And if I'm not wrong, were the Beatles like the first popular music act to really change up their identity as the years went on?
I know that a big motivation was, a big inspiration was the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, and how they used the studio in these weird and wonderful ways. Like Good Vibrations, you couldn't have performed that on stage and have it anywhere near as interesting as the record. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, I don't think any band at the height of their powers had decided, let's not sell out stadiums anymore. Let's just sit in our studio and make funny sounds.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that some of the most powerful entertainers at that time were like sort of contemporaneously starting to experiment with changing their identities, but not maybe so radically as changing their entire business model. Like Elvis went through some phases between like the early 50s up into the 60s, and and so on. And the Beach Boys, like David's mentioning, had started the transition into the psychedelic Beach Boys rather than the surfing, be true to your school Beach Boys. But I think they took like the zeitgeist of reinvention and just like pushed it way further than anybody had gone.
Yeah. And I don't think it would have worked out as well if they had followed Elvis's example of going into the army.
That's right.
So when it comes to Beatles songs, which Beatle is mainly responsible for writing your personal favorite Beatles songs, and Why do you think that you're drawn to their songs in particular?
Well, you know, uh, as I said before on the show, it's always Paul for me. He like Tomo, I think the harmony is what tends to grab me the most about a lot of the Beatles songs. I think what they were doing harmonically, aside from maybe Brian Wilson and a couple of other exceptions, was unique at the time and remains nearly unique. I think that the line that they rode between accessibility and creativity is just like perfect. It's just like exactly where I want to be, and it appeals so directly to my sensibilities as a musician. And yeah, it's really the harmony that keeps you guessing, but also like I had this experience as a guitarist, and David and Tomo, I don't know if you had this experience, but like the first songs I ever tried to learn were Beatles songs on guitar, and I had this crazy thing where like I knew all the songs so well and they were all so singable and they all seemed so intuitive that when I sat down to try and learn them, I was mystified by how complicated the chord progressions were to all of them. And
Right.
that to me is just the genius in a nutshell of Paul, especially because Paul can write a melody that it's just like butter, like glass over the top of these really strange and unusual harmonies. And so that, I think, more than anything is why I love Paul, and that's where my ear is always drawn. I mean, I think he's a great lyricist too. Sometimes he's criticized for being too simple, but I think that at his best, you know, he was just the most universal. So, and Yesterday was a perfect example of that. So, yeah, that's me.
This is a really hard one to pick one song. Almost like a lot of songs are very identical. It's like Josh said. It seems like simple, but when you sit down to figure it out, always wow, surprise. And so smooth and sounds like just one key, but then just move to, outside of it. And it's great mix about like show tune or pop tune and little blues and little jazz. But everything mixed. That's what Yesterday. That's great. There's sort of 2/5, but then 4/4/5. But one of my song really influenced by Beatles because I learned jazz, so naturally I tend to use jazz chord progression. But then Beatles, they used a lot +6, +7, like almost like sounds like a pentatonic, and then same time, beautiful line and beautiful chords. I always wonder how much John Lennon really tell Paul, we should go this way, go that way on that direction. That's always, I don't know, personally, I want to know that. So I would say Yesterday's best one. Easy to say. Yeah.
Well, Josh, like you said before, and Tomo, like you were just saying, when you learn these Beatles songs on an instrument, you learn how complicated these chord progressions really are. But man, when I watch each one of your breakdown or cover videos on YouTube of these songs, like Tomo, the video you made of George Harrison's guitar solo on Till There Was You.
Oh, that was shocking that I didn't know those guys really play like a lot of diminished chords, augmented chords, and like flat nine sounds, the guitar licks. They learn. I mean, they sit down, learn other people's songs really, really well, and then that song was really cool. It's almost like half jazz, half pop. It's a great song. And I use that song to teach my student. Sometimes I give them, hey, learn this song by next week. It's what? It's hard. Yeah, that's good test song. Yeah.
David, what about you? Who writes your favorite Beatles songs?
I always think I like Paul and John equally, but then if I write a list of my favorite Beatles songs, like 80-90% of them are John. Strawberry Fields I already mentioned. I Am the Walrus is also another big favorite of mine. And almost part of the reason I think it is maybe it's like John seemed to be more willing to go to George Martin and just say, "What do you think, George? Like, do something," and not really like steer George and just kind of give it to him. And that's I think Strawberry Fields is a great example of that. I Am the Walrus, where you're almost hearing more of a George Martin composition than a John Lennon. Whereas although Paul did use George, he had far more idea about what he wanted. So it was kind of George interpreting what Paul wanted, whereas with John, George was left with more free reign. And I think perhaps that's why I love some of those wacky arrangements so much.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Like, I mean, if you listen to the instrumental version of "I Am the Walrus," it's like this insanely crafted and complex classical music arrangement that George Martin wrote. So
Mm,
you're right. Maybe the Lennon Martin songwriting team is one that I should take note of more.
mm,
I also think that part of what made John and Paul such a great writing team at their best was um, John. He tended to write really angular chord progressions, like really like awkward sometimes sounding, like like harsh juxtapositions harmonically. And Paul was so interested in what was pretty that it's really those two things working in tandem that makes many of their most memorable tunes. The I mean, yeah, like Strawberry Fields, obviously one of my favorite songs, just such a genius piece. And Paul would have never written that because that melody, and I think I've got bronchitis right now, but the melody da 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 ba da 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 da.
yeah.
That's from like an octatonic scale, and Paul would have never written a melodic passage like that, you know. And so yeah, those two guys working together, because John was, I don't know that he had the ear that Paul had, but he was, as I was saying earlier, just so fearless with where he would go harmonically. And it can be just extremely compelling. So yeah, they were a great pair for that reason.
Now, when it comes to the Beatles playing on their songs, do you think that their choices of instruments contributed to their sound as much as their songwriting did? For example, for those listening who might not know too much detail about the instruments that they played, at the beginning of the band, Paul played that iconic Hofner violin bass, and then he later switched to a Rickenbacker bass. And George Harrison started off with a Gretsch guitar and progressed to a Stratocaster and then a Telecaster, but they also experimented with Moog synthesizers and sitars. So, what do you think about these instrument choices?
You know, I, over the years, my perspective on instruments has changed. I think that I used to put a lot more weight on what people were playing in terms of what it contributed to their sound and the choices that they made. And as a guitarist, I mean, I definitely, to an extent, do make different choices when I'm playing different kinds of instruments. I think that every different instrument has things that it likes to do and things that it doesn't like to do, and it's good, you as the player are going to kind of intuit some of those things, and it's going to influence the choices that you make, both in terms of writing and performance. But I don't think it extends much beyond that. I think that there's a subtle influence that's imparted by, like, oh, if I'm playing a Strat, then like this kind of line is going to feel more natural, right? Like, as opposed to a Rickenbacker or whatever. I think that part of the reason that Paul was able to be so insanely dexterous in a lot of his bass lines is because, like, the Hofner's a little bit shorter scale, and he came from a guitar background, so he's playing with a flat pick, and he didn't have to develop like fingerstyle technique. But he could have played any shorter scale bass, and the same Paul bass lines would have probably come out. I think it contributes to the sound of the recordings and what makes them so special. But then that's what the engineers are doing too, because like you play a Strat through one kind of amp and it sounds super different than if you play it through a Vox AC30 and then you play it through a Leslie. It's going to sound like two different instruments. So it's really to me just what any given instrument was bringing out of them as players. Sometimes when you pick up a particular guitar, I think it's easier you'll find inspiration in a new instrument, right? Like sometimes it's like, okay, well, I wrote this song on this instrument because like it just felt like people say like it felt like it was inside the guitar, like waiting to come out, this song or whatever. So it may have been that, but like I don't, I think it's often overstated personally, the influence that the instruments had on what they did.
Yeah, it was a very interesting question. I love about equipment, amps to guitars, I love. But about the Beatles, to me, it's all about songwriting about the band. So I never really pay attention what's the difference between, Definitely earlier has that earlier sounds, and the 60 has a little bit more, that sophisticated sound. But to me, not really huge amount influence on the songs to me, yeah, but I like Hofner bass sound definitely. And some of the Gretsch, guitar sounds. It's great for lines and rhythm guitar. Funny when I think about, I love a Stratocaster, but when I think about Beatles, a Stratocaster is a little too not too pretty. It's almost now really stand out, you know. Yeah, should have a little bit more like something different like this. One pickup makes more particular sounds. I like that. I like kind of limitation of instruments so that instrument really gives you different zone to write a song like that.
When it comes to instruments and the Beatles, it's kind of similar to what I was saying earlier about how after 66 there was just this massive change, where before that they were very much like a classic archetypal rock and roll band, couple guitars, a bass and drums. They occasionally got a keyboard involved of some sort, but it wasn't very practical to, especially in the 60s, to perform with any lineup beyond just guitars and drums. And then the moment they get in the studio, it's almost like the Beatles are famous for, more famous sometimes for their instruments than some of their songs, like the mellotron, the sitar, and also their use of strings and brass, and these instruments that were very foreign to pop music at the time. But now, you can't really, it wouldn't be weird at all to hear strings or horns or anything like that on a pop song.
Yeah, I think actually today, I think David makes an interesting point there about like, I think that the instrument choices actually did make a huge imprint on the Beatles sound, but it wasn't the core instruments that they were associated with. It tended to be more on a song by song basis. Choosing to start something with a mellotron is now like anytime anybody hears the flute, the flute samples on a mellotron, it's like, oh, just like Strawberry Fields. Anytime somebody hears like an electric harpsichord, it's like, oh, it sounds just like Because. So like I think that the distinctive and super Beatlesy instruments really weren't the things that they were necessarily writing the songs on. It was more the things that grabbed your ear and set each track apart in the studio.
Now, while we're on the subject of talking about the Beatles playing instruments, one common criticism is that they were not the most technically proficient musicians. What are some characteristics of their playing that stand out to you guys? And honestly, what do you think of them as musicians?
Yeah, I've heard that critique before. I think I think it might have been Quincy Jones maybe who put it very colorfully one time, and I won't recite it just in case it's a misattribution. But it was not a kind remark upon the Beatles' technical ability.
Right.
But yeah, to me it's just so immaterial that like they weren't technical masters of their craft. I think they were technical. I think they were masters of songwriting, and it's kind of a question of what do you want out of a band. I think it's tempting to, when a band is put on as high a podium as the Beatles are, it's tempting to want to hold them up to every highest standard possible. But I think that critiquing their technical prowess on their instruments is just completely losing sight of the forest for the trees. I think that technical skill does not always go hand in hand with the ability to write great and memorable songs. And oftentimes I think it can actually be something that gets in the way of writing great songs, because I think the temptation to chop out, as we say, in the music world is so great that you can lose sight of the sort of pure emotional thread that a great song should be. So I think that they spent their time and their talent wisely with instruments. I think that they wrote a lot of really memorable parts, even if they weren't the most dexterous parts in the world. And in terms of like who was a great player, it's got to be, well, all of them did such great things. Like even Ringo, who catches all the heat, right? Like Ringo's influence, because of his technical limitations, was enormous on the world of rock drums. And the choices that he made are just so distinctive that like, who cares, whether he can beat Stuart Copeland in a drum off? Like, it just doesn't matter, because like when he wrote great parts for the song, that's kind of it to me, and it's the same with the guitar solos. It's the same with, and actually another area where they were genuinely very technically proficient that's often overlooked is their harmony singing. Their ability to blend 3-part harmony and write 3-part harmonies was one of the best in the decade, easily up there with the Beach Boys, except it was just 3 parts instead of 5. They, I think, developed a unique language in terms of voicing. They were able to blend timbres so tightly that it's hard to tell who's singing which part. So yeah, I always kind of brush that criticism off. I think it's a waste of time.
This is a very popular topic that people talk about. They're just fine as a musician, and they're a great songwriter, a great band member. See, I play jazz, I practice guitar, and I like a lot of different things. But then that's become distraction about playing guitar, improvising, but not write any songs. I counted, I only have about less than 50 songs, and I'm 58 years old, So I was like, wow, I had to hurry up, So sometimes I play more things, and that's really distraction for the songwriter. So to me, practicing guitar or write more songs in the studio, I wish I can do more, like, go to the studio, songwriting. But and like Josh said, Ringo too, some people criticize about his technique, but that's a perfect drummer. When you have a band, if somebody plays too much and everybody plays so well, then what happens? Everything becomes distraction, and every song becomes so long. Every song has too many ideas. You never settle in. So to me, they had a perfect proficiency in every instrument, that they know diminished chords, they know augmented chords, they know a lot of chords that are very tasteful, support the song, not just impress people, play like everywhere. You know what I mean? That's like, I teach so many people, and I understand a lot of different, virtuosity in technique. But to me, I don't really care about technique. I care about more song. That's why you guys love Beatles, And yes, just a guitar solo. I love guitar solo on Beatles because it's a melody. It's not scale. It's not chops. That's what I like about Beatles. I want to say more, but they're perfect to me.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on what Tomo just said there. Like, we talked about how much they could fit into a 2-minute song. I think that if they were more technically proficient, they probably wouldn't be 2-minute songs. It's too much temptation.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. What happens is, if you have more technique, then you have more possibilities. You want to try more. And ended up, you expect more things that are not necessary.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's less is better. Japanese saying, eat, 2/3 of food, not whole. That's good for health. That's always say, But
Well, I think Tomo put it well in the sense that they knew enough to not have it limit them. So they knew not just the major and minor chords, but like diminished and augmented, like you said. And they had enough proficiency that they can add a bit of flair here and there, but didn't get carried away. I do think a secret weapon that did help them, though, is George Martin, where quite literally, if they wanted a more sophisticated musical moment, particularly a piano solo, they would just give it to George Martin, like Lovely Rita or Rocky Raccoon, or most famously In My Life. They quite literally say, here you go, George, there's 16 bars, like, do something.
Yeah, definitely.
And he would just suddenly show off and create the most tasteful but amazing instrumental passage.
Can I add one more thing? I'm so glad they didn't know tablature. They use more imagination, and they learn great song. That's why they know, diminished or augmented, or, minor, major, seventh chord. And yeah, then again, David, I agree. George always had brilliant idea about classical, melody over the song, or, strings arrangement. And yeah, I always wonder how much he really influenced the chords and everything. But yeah, everybody did an amazing job.
So, which moment in a Beatles song is the most memorable for you as a musician?
Oh man, it's usually, gosh, it's probably has to be just the kick of the song, like the first like 3 seconds of the song, as is usually what's the most memorable. And it's funny because I think that's something that I've understood at an intuitive level for a long time, but nobody's ever asked me that before, and I've never thought about it consciously. But I think it's something that a lot of Beatles nerds maybe quietly pride themselves on, is that if you hear the first like 1 second of a Beatles song, you can name the song. And that is a testament to, you know, it's a testament to George Martin, certainly, but they themselves as composers too, that it's not just like, all right, you know, 8-bar vamp for free, and then we're into verse 1. You know, it's like every single song has a slightly different introduction. Something obviously has that incredible drum fill that starts it, you know. Yesterday, you've got that distinctive whole step down guitar. You've got the Mellotron on Strawberry Fields. Just like basically any song that we've been talking about, you can pick it and it starts in a completely different way. And so that to me is probably the most distinctive part. There's some exceptions. There's some other songs where like Something to me, for whatever reason, my favorite part of Something is not the guitar solo. It's not the opening drum fill. Paul plays this one particular line on the bass when the verse comes back around and they're doing the verse in harmony, where he's doing this doom do 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 that he plays every time, but then this time he goes do 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 do. That like it would be gratuitous if anybody else played it at any other moment in that song, but like that to me is just like the greatest spot in Something. And then also the bass moment in Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey is another one of my all-time favorites, where the bass comes in double tracked after during the come-ons. But again, Everybody's Got Something to Hide. It's got that bum, bap, bum, bum, bap drum thing at the intro with the ascending guitar triads, and it's like 1 second, and you know what the song is. So there are moments in the insides that I like, but it's always the first like bar of the song to me is just one of the most amazing things they did.
Yeah, I really love those ones too. And I love Paul's octave slides on the bass. I think it's just so signature Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Tomo, what about you?
Yeah, I a lot of things I agree with Josh. Like their songs, just the first couple of seconds, just the one note beginning, and just you know who they are, what song they're playing, and so much impact. And then that really brings a memory, and that's bring to the entire song. You know, to me, like, see, I told you I listened a lot of compilation album, and after that. I think Therapy is just the piano intro, and then like hi-hats and the parts and little echo, you know, delay or like that. And then the guitar solo and just so much. That guitar solo really influenced me because it's a melody and really following the chords, you know. But again, once you start talking, you can stop so many great songs, you know. And Paul's bass, dun, 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 it just little things, like not technical, but just so melodic, and they are just good at it, finding their own sound, you know. So amazing.
I think my favorite thing about Beatles songs is that there's often just little moments that happen, a bit like what you guys have been describing already, which just happen once, and then therefore you're kind of waiting for it the whole song. You're like, here it comes, here's my favorite bit, and it's so fleeting, but it's all those little moments that add up and create such a unique listen. And it's not like they've copied and pasted verse 1. Okay, verse 2 will be the same as verse 1, etc., etc. Bridge, outro, done. So every song has its own character, its own journey, just little quirks. Like my second favorite Beatles song is Hey Bulldog, and just some of the silly little like lyrical moments and sound effects. Every time I'm just like, yes, there it is, great, and it's just like gets you excited.
Yeah, I think that I really like you pointing out just the little moments and the things that happen once. Like the Beatles were such masters of hooks, and hooks aren't just great great choruses. You know, sometimes a hook is anything from a song that like once you've heard it, you can't not like kind of anticipate it, because you know it's like it's exciting for us to hear something that only happens once in a song, and it's increasingly rare in the world of like pop production to only have something happen once, because I think many producers would want to say like no, like it's going to sound like a mistake or whatever, but for the Beatles sometimes it was a mistake and they just left it in, and that's extremely compelling a lot of the time, you know. And then sometimes it's a deliberate choice. It happens twice in the song, I guess, but like on Good Morning, where there's like the bar of, I guess, 10 on the verse. That is like such a silly thing to put there, but it's my favorite part of the whole song. So yeah, there's just hooks absolutely everywhere, even if it's a one-off.
The hooks, yeah, and then the Day Tripper, that riff, if I do a gig, at least I play that once and somewhere, because that's something that it just works, blues and funk riff, and then just transfer. Actually, when I teach guitar, some riff, I teach that riff so that any fingering, any strings, if you can play, that real riff brings you next level of improvisation, and then city, but a lot of songs, pop band, rock, blues band, always 12 bars, or AABA, everything fits. But Beatles always has 2 bars or 3. I like that just because I tell Berkeley students, that's what you have to do. Don't think about theory or rules, because it sounds good and leave it,
Definitely.
Yeah, just on what Tomo was saying there, it's almost like the way that the Beatles broke traditional structures like 8-bar forms, 12-bar forms, it's like hidden in plain sight, because for so many years you're listening to these songs and they feel so natural, and yet you go to learn it. I think it's Yesterday feels like such like a perfectly balanced song, and yet it's not like, okay, it's like I imagine it would be 16 bars and then maybe a middle 8 or 8 bars. I think it's 13 bars at the A section, but it feels perfect, and it just shows that you don't need to gravitate towards these familiar, you know, forms like 16 bars, 12-bar blues, all that sort of stuff.
That's true, yeah.
That's so interesting. Why do you think that worked for them? Was it like something about having ignorance when it came to music theory that just made it seem more natural?
So I think my guess is I think they don't use manuscript paper, always writing 4 bars, or they're just playing and then singing, and then just whatever feel good, they just follow it, and then they just decide that way, I think. Because see, I teach music, so I understand. Sometimes if you learn so much forms, and first you have to learn form, 12-bar blues, some 24-bar, whatever. But then if you learn too much, then you almost like immediately you think you have to be staying in form. Yeah. So even my original song, that's the fear of staying in form, So, one of my song it's definitely not fits like a regular form, because almost like one form has bridge in it, or sometimes A section and B section a little longer. And that's, I think, slight influence from not afraid to go for it. That's great.
Yeah, if I were to guess, I would say that, I mean, there are definitely some cases where they're trying to be playful with expectations, but I think in most cases they just weren't thinking at all about structure and form and things like that. I played for a long time in a duo with a guy who grew up in North Carolina, listening to a lot of traditional folk music like Doc Watson and people like that. And when he would write songs, there are conventions around that North Carolina folk bluegrass tradition that it's entirely oral. There's nothing is ever written down, so it's just understood that sometimes there'll be a bar of 2 that'll like go at the end of a chorus, or like you can just vamp for an indefinite number of bars between between verses, like take as long as the singer needs, and that's just like, and so he would write things like that, and then we would hire other players to come in on the gigs, and they would be like, God, these songs are so complicated, and it's just like, no, they're not complicated. It's just listen for it, and I think that's kind of if I were to guess, I'd say that's the approach they were just taking there.
David, you've brought up George Martin a lot in this conversation. So now I want to ask you all specifically, how do you think George Martin's production and influence played a role in the Beatles' music?
Oh, I mean, it just can't be overstated for me. I mean, as David mentioned, the actual performances that he gave are huge parts of the songs themselves, but the string orchestrations that he wrote, just the general melding of chamber music and classical music, it wouldn't have worked, I think, through anyone as well as him. Maybe I think that he was just the right person for what they were doing. I mentioned the last time I was on, Jack, that I had heard somewhere that he had come from novelty radio production prior to working with the Beatles. He was doing like comedy stuff for radio, and they constantly had to come up with new gags and new like weird sounds to add to the broadcast. And that background is just so perfect for a band that had such a sense of humor. I think that he was just able to kind of understand and intuit what they were looking for when it should be serious, when it should be huge strings, and then when it should be something that's completely wacko. And he balanced that so well. I mean, I think that maybe the most important thing that he did, though, which I love listening to all the outtakes of songs where you can hear him behind the glass talking to them, is guiding them through takes. Because the Beatles sort of famously would do 30, 40 takes of a song, which, like, to me is just completely, I can't imagine trying to give a good performance on my 30th take of something. I think Let It Be's take 28 was the keeper. Like, that's insane. And George had the ability to sift through 28 takes, listen to them all in a row, and say, yep, that was the one. That was the one that had the right feeling. That was the one that had the tempo, that delivered the emotion of the song the best. Like, oh, let's try a little bit less on the solo section. Oh, you're over singing this. Like, his intuition for that, even, and his endurance for that, I think, is maybe the most important thing that he brought to what they did.
He's like a guardian for Beatles, and even they joke around playing more takes. Like Jeff said, I only can take 2-3 takes, and when I play with the Steve Gadd, I have to do one take because he does one take, Yeah. And we recorded, 3 songs in 2 hours, But yeah, that's amazing. Really, over 20 takes, and still encourage them to make a better take, and then choose them. That's a lot harder work, but also string arrangement and song form. I'm sure song forms, he really give them idea about, do this way, do that way. So I think I've heard he's the 5th Beatles like that. He's probably that much influence, control over the whole band. He was a very important person, I think.
I think he was absolutely essential to their success, and that's more evident in the later music, where you can really genuinely hear his contributions, whether it's string arrangements or piano performances or whatever. Even in the early music, though, he was making arrangement calls and suggestions, like on Can't Buy Me Love. He was the one who suggested take a little bit of the chorus and use that as an intro rather than going straight into the 12-bar form for the verse. But I think what was so unique about George Martin at that time is he was somebody who was classically trained, but yet didn't take himself too seriously. Case in point, the comedy music that Josh was mentioning. There's a lot that said at the time that classical music was still treated as like the true music, and the pop and rock that the Beatles were doing was sort of seen as this fad. Abbey Road at the time was EMI studio opened by Elgar, classical composer. It was a classical music studio. The Beatles were just operating out there almost like second-class citizens. And I think George Martin was able to appreciate that their music is just as valuable as classical music, and could bring all of those skills and perspectives and education that he had and introduce the band to a much wider palette of ideas.
I didn't know that Elgar was responsible for opening Abbey Road. Man, that's one of those.
Yeah, the blue plaque on the door. That's what it says.
Oh man.
Yeah.
That's one of those trivia facts that like just makes history kind of shrink for you a little bit. It's like when I found out that Prokofiev had done a film score at one point. I'm like, wait, what year is it?
Oh yeah, Lieutenant Kaiji or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Also, I didn't know George Martin did comedy related music and like that. And
it's part of the reason that the Beatles liked him, because he did worked with the Goons, who were kind of similar to like Monty Python, with like silly humor.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, this guy, he can't be that boring because he's worked with the Goons, and we love the Goons.
That's cool.
So can we take a quick vote here? Is George Martin officially the 5th Beatle?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
To be honest, I think he's arguably my favorite Beatle, because like if anyone asks which Beatle I am, it's George Martin, the guy who's like behind the scenes, quietly just getting on with stuff, shying away from the limelight.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
A lot of artists have cited the Beatles as inspirations, like even artists you wouldn't think of really, like the Wu-Tang Clan. But when it comes to modern music, how do you think that the influence of the Beatles is the most evident?
Oh, I need a second to think about that, because I mean, I just, it's one of those things where to draw an old comparison, actually, that's a bit like asking, like, what's the influence of, you know, Christianity on society in America, right? Like, it's so omnipresent, and it's so infiltrated into the way that we think and move, like that's how the Beatles are for modern music to me. You know, it's you can't just be like, oh, that sounds like a Beatles song. I mean, like, certainly there are instances of that, but I think the way that people think about production, the way people think about songwriting, the way people think about what makes a successful song, the way that the Beatles contributed to the concept of a rock band that wrote all their own music, and or, like, you know, that does something that's between kind of like art rock and like straight rock and roll, the incorporation of such diverse sounds, the studio tricks that they, I mean, like, it's literally endless the way that the modern music is impacted by it. Yeah, one of my favorite examples is Toxic by Britney Spears. Every time I listen to Toxic, I think, like, that sounds like a Beatles song, because it's got, you know, it's got the Eastern influences, although they use samples, which I guess the Beatles also sort of pioneered. It uses Eastern influences, it uses samples, it's got unusual scales in it, but it's also really poppy, it's got a lot of curb appeal, and it's a great song. So it's just, yeah, it's, you can't escape it. Like, how didn't the Beatles influence music now is kind of how it feels to me.
Yeah, like just it's really hard to describe how we were influenced by Beatles, but I think first, four guys, they got a band, you know, write original music, and so many songs, so great. So to me, just like that's, you know, principal idea that how to be a good songwriter, how to be a good member of the band, you know, work together. And a good example, you know, my former student John Mayer, he writes really great songs, you know, and that's, to me, it's like indirectly, but I'm sure influenced by Beatles. A lot arrangement, you know. Why John plays piano, you know what I mean, like that. It's already guitar player, but, you know, play piano and just adding, you know, different things. And yeah, to be a great songwriter, I think that's really Beatles, you know. So
Yeah, you know, I was listening to Corey Wong's podcast, who was actually just a previous guest on this podcast, and Corey was interviewing John Mayer about his new album Sob Rock. I guess it was a couple years ago, and
okay.
John actually pointed out that one of his songs was inspired by David Gilmour's guitar solo on Paul McCartney's "No More Lonely Nights" song from the 1980s. And it, you know, it really just goes to show you could really pull inspiration from anywhere in a Beatles song, even after they broke up. It's really cool.
Yeah. For example, even like John's, you know, when he came to me, he wanted to be a number one guitar player. And end of the semester, he changed his mind because so many great guitar players anyway. So he said, I think I can really write good songs because I'm writing a lot of songs. That's when I told him, leave school, just write a song. When you're ready, come back. Guitar is not important. Writing songs is more important. True, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it worked.
I think the way that Josh put it is really well put, in the sense that it's, you can't really remove the Beatles from history and have a look at what we would be left with without the entire thing just collapsing. A bit like how you can't imagine what geopolitics would be like if World War II had never happened. It's like there would have had to have been another World War II. There would have had to have been another Beatles. Otherwise, it would just be unrecognizable. I think when you look at like what music was like, pop music was like at the beginning of the 60s and what it was like at the end of the 60s, obviously the Beatles weren't the single artist, you know, moving things forward. There were other artists as well, but they definitely carried a lot, pardon the pun, carried a lot of that weight in changing it from just like R&B imitations of American blues to an art form of itself. They sort of pioneered that.
That's a good point, David. Without the Beatles, a lot of people still play 145, you know?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Well, and actually, and further to that point, I think that part of what they did so successfully was they bridged the divide between, like, quote unquote rock and roll of the early days and then quote unquote pop music at the end of the 50s, which was basically still like what we now consider the American songbook. You know, they what they did was they created this crazy blend of like the R&B, like early rock and roll sound, plus what had been considered real pop music up to that point, right? They wrote these things that now that belong in, you know, songbooks like the Fake Book or whatever, because they're so ubiquitous, but it's because they bridge that gap for people, I think, between what had been previously just thought of as two genres that never met.
Yeah, so they definitely some of, I can't really name the song right away, but some of the song not just rock and roll, it's really R&B, you know, soul, you know, but then they made it their own, which is really cool. Yeah, almost like really respect, you know, old American music, and they wrote really great songs.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, a lot of their stuff, it's like halfway between like your rollover Beethovens and then something like Come Fly With Me or something like that. You know, it's like right in the middle of those two things is where a lot of the Beatles stuff lives from a songwriting perspective, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, and Tomo, now that you mentioned that, I could totally hear a group like the Ronettes singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and having it'll probably sound just right.
Right.
Now, I don't know if you guys have had the chance to listen to the new Beatles song Now and Then, which came out a couple of weeks ago, but if you have, what did you think about the song itself, the use of AI in the song, and while we're on the topic of AI, do you think AI will be used in music a lot going forward?
So Now and Then, I have complicated feelings about it. I think I should say that like Now and Then to me is like, it's like a piece of contemporary art. It's like a piece of conceptual art to me, where on a purely aesthetic level, I don't really resonate with it at all. But that doesn't mean that I don't like it necessarily. There are certain parts of what it represents that I like. I think it's really cool that, you know, that we as Beatles fans have an opportunity to hear all four of them together on something, I think, that's a decent approximation of what it might have sounded like had they all been in the same room at the same time. I actually don't necessarily have an issue with the use of AI in this context, you know, because really all they were doing was extracting John's voice from the piano in the original demo recording, which, you know, I'm so grateful that we have that, especially on the Get Back documentary, especially in some of the remixes that have now been released of the original 4-track recordings where we can hear them in stereo with the drums and the vocals in the middle, you know, like, I'm fine with that. What I'm actually not, what crosses into the uncanny valley for me is the music video for Now and Then, which places all four Beatles on screen at the same time, but at different ages. And you have George sort of winking cheekily in a Sgt. Pepper's outfit while you have 80-year-old Paul standing next to him playing bass. And that just kind of gives me the ick in a way that's difficult to describe. But yeah, I mean, I don't care for the song aesthetically. I think the original demo is beautiful. It sounds like an unfinished song, you know, and I think that part of the recording quality of the demo suits the mood incredibly well. It's very melancholy, and I love the demo. I love the original composition, but what they did with it, it just really sounds like a lot of 90s Jeff Lynne. It's absolutely brick-walled, just to hell. Like, it's so loud and it's so in your face that it doesn't sound at all like any of the earlier Beatles catalog. Hearing the young voices try and blend with the old voices is really just feels like a reminder of mortality to me than anything. And, you know, and then there's the ethical question of, that's not even AI related. It's the ethical question of, like, they could have never had John's permission, you know, to do that with that song. And even George, who worked on it in the 90s, he didn't sign off on the final version. It's in a similar vein of, you know, putting holographic Tupac on stage at Coachella. It's just like, I don't know, man. Just like putting somebody's name on artwork that's changed and then released posthumously is very fraught moral territory for me. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, so I think it's a successful piece of art in that I'm going to be thinking about it a lot, but it's not a successful piece of art to me just from an aesthetic standpoint. I don't care for it. I don't care for the final product. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I had a really mixed feeling too, because I saw like a little bit of documentary part of that, and then I listened to the, you know, video, which is just that, like a kind of weird to see different age and just almost like great art to put everything together. Like, you just like, almost like you're making amazing thumbnails, But you know what I mean? That's like, I think that technology and AI, yes, no problem, because that's tool to really separate things, and then you can work on something. Educational purpose, that's great too. And this different resonate to just the original version, really like, wow, just like in the room, and then soft, and you can hear everything clearly. That's why you pay attention to listen to more. But then the final one comes up like, yeah, almost like, do you really want to make the music, or it's because I do business, music business, like you see like YouTube, my own site or like that, and sometimes we make things to get the attention. You just want to get the attention to do that. Also, I really felt bad that John Lennon wanna work together if you want to release something. In other words, always John Lennon, Paul, those two together sounds great, But seems like that's like using leftover material, and then a few guys just trying to put everything together with the producer or other parts of music industry people. So I'm not sure really called Beatles, it's just like great project and great art, but just I think original. Also, when I hear the original, I'm not sure they really follow that course or they just
No.
changed it, right?
They definitely changed some of it, and there was this really strikingly contrasting chorus section on the
Right.
original that they just changed. They just totally changed that part.
So that's the part that's kind of bugs me, because sometimes if you use somebody's art, leftover art, then you add something around it, not changing it. That's the part I felt a little shocked they changed. John goes like, "Hey man, what did you do?" you know, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. So that's like a really but only one part. Just documentary part is like, wow, this is an amazing bunch of people that spend time together playing music, and that's very rare. Nowadays, very rare. People can really spend hours together making music, you know? So that's the part from that song grabbed my heart. Like, wow, those, you know, all the day, amazing experience. Yeah.
I think the sort of story of the song, the journey it's been on, and the fact it's literally called Now and Then, and the lyrics are just so poignant, is sort of thing you couldn't write. It's kind of too perfect, the story of it. But I do think the song, I don't know why they made it sound so pop music. It's like it begins and you think, here comes Adele, here comes Lewis Capaldi. No, it's John Lennon in an apartment 50 years ago. When you start, obviously they had this great isolation on the vocal. They managed to pull it out of that demo, but it's still a lo-fi recording. So the fact that they went with the most hi-fi of hi-fi is so weird. I don't know why they did that. It's not like you can't make something sound old. Father John
Yeah.
Misty is a great example of a modern artist who sounds like he could have come out in the 70s, and they should have lent into that, and they didn't. So I don't really know the motivation there. But on a wider point about AI, I think for me, the only kind of scary bit about AI is making sure that musicians still receive some sort of credit, some sort of royalty where due, that music doesn't just become this thing that somehow everybody owns and therefore nobody can make any money from it. But from an aesthetic point of view of like, is AI going to destroy music? I think good music has always been and will always be democratic, because people can choose what they listen to now more than ever. If AI leads to great music, then that's great. If AI leads to crap music, then people won't listen to it and it will die a death. So it can. I'm not worried about that aspect of AI.
I wasn't alive when sample-based music really started to take off in the 80s. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was a similar conversation at that time around, oh, this is going to be the death of music. Nobody's going to record anything original anymore. Everybody's just going to go back and use old samples. But I think that the jury is now pretty conclusive on the idea that sample-based music has been great for music as a whole. There's bad sample-based music that exists, but by and large, you give artists more tools and they're going to make more interesting things. Anything that's that powerful is going to yield not only bad art but also probably damage in some regards. But I'm willing to be optimistic about AI in terms of its capabilities. I think that had they said, oh, John only wrote one verse for this song, and we've fed a language model all of his other compositions, and it's written a second verse, like that would have been problematic, right? But that's part of what's interesting about this moment with AI is that we're finding in real time where the lines are of what we're comfortable with and what we're not. And this particular use I'm comfortable with, but there are certainly plenty that I'm sure we'll see over the coming years that will be less sanguine.
The AI thing, I find like the way that AIs learn, like you said, where like you feed in examples of what you want them to create, that's a really interesting moral conundrum of, you could easily point to that and be like, well, that's copyright infringement. You're using our thing to make something new. But the Beatles basically took Buddy Holly's 24 songs and spun them out into new songs. So like that wasn't copyright infringement, but it was the same process. So it'll be interesting to see how that gets litigated over the coming years.
Educational purpose, like if you took one part and you listen to the drum parts, guitar parts, bass part, you're surprised how much they're not in tune sometimes,
Yeah.
In other words, a lot of people nowadays, people think, oh, it has to be in tune, or sometimes people care so much about time, I mean, time is important, but just a little bit ahead or a little late, they try to fix it. But if you listen to all the stuff, it's a little bit out of tune, but that makes kind of stereo effect in a way, So that's why, just educational purpose, I think not too bad idea to, listen to the parts. Yeah. To use that to listen to my parts, I think you find more mistakes from my parts. Yeah.
I also think, the way they've been using it with the remixes is really interesting. And I continue to have really mixed feelings about the remixes because like there's a part of me that just screams like, this is historical revisionism. Like some of the people who worked on these things in the first place are still alive and we're just changing the choices that they made as a part of this piece of art. That's like, it feels like if you were, when Michelangelo was still alive, to just be like, God's biceps on the roof of the Sistine Chapel look a little weird. Like, maybe we should just go tweak that, So like, you just leave it alone. Like, that's what, that's what the piece of art is. But at the same time, like, so for me, the litmus test that I've kind of tried to use with all the remixes that are only possible because of AI is, am I feeling the song more or less when I hear the remixed version? Do I resonate with it more or less? And it's interesting because it's really split down the middle, even within single albums. I generally prefer, for instance, the 2009 remasters of Abbey Road, but I love the 2018 remixes of the White Album. I think they're outstanding. I like some of the new remixes on Red and Blue, but then some of them are a disaster, in my opinion. I think the new stereo remix of Love Me Do, if you haven't listened to that one, it is bad. I think they ruined Love Me Do on the remix. They just cut the tambourine out on the last verse, for instance, for no reason.
Wow.
There's like kick drum hits that are missing. It's really weird. So yeah, it's AI, the feelings are developing as we go.
That's actually really interesting that you brought up the remixes because I've been listening to them too, just like the Red Album and the Blue Album recent releases. And my feelings are a little mixed as well. There are some songs, like you said, like the 2018 White Album remixes where I'm blown away by it. And then there are songs like, I Am the Walrus or She Loves You. And I mean, She Loves You, in my opinion, is probably the worst remix. I think it sounds really just cluttered.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, I mean, there's cool things also that I get to hear. Like at the end of I Feel Fine, you can hear one of the Beatles barking like a dog, which I thought was a little fun. How about you, David and Tomo? Did you guys listen to the remixes yet?
I've not had a listen to them yet. And generally speaking, I don't get particularly excited about different mixes. It is interesting to hear the different choices. But what I was thinking is, I guess, the sort of following on from what Josh was saying, you could argue that when you remix this stuff, you're not actually tampering with history because the original was still there if you want it. But actually, the more I think about it, how will future generations know which version they're listening to? It makes me think of Star Wars, where I didn't know growing up that I was watching the 1997 remaster where George Lucas shoved a bunch of weird aliens in, and then now the idea that isn't the true Star Wars is I've been kind of defrauded.
Right, and it's and the new versions of Star Wars, like the one you can watch on Disney Plus, it looks amazing and the colors are great and everything's so sharp, but at the same time, I just kind of want to be able to access the original, and the one that's on Disney Plus is the one that's going to probably be preserved for history. I think in many cases there are now 3 or 4 versions of the same Beatles song on streaming services, and for people who aren't like us, super nerds about I prefer the mono, but or the Glyn Johns mix versus the whatever, it does matter, I think, when you produce more and more versions, because it's fun to have both, but at the same time, if only one is ultimately going to kind of percolate down, through the topsoil of history, it's just well, but is it the original? Is it the one that the artist intended, or is it just one of these other kind of opinions on the matter?
Yeah, and I saw I can't remember what video it was recently, but somebody, maybe it was a Beatles quiz or something, and for a couple of the Let It Be tracks, they'd used the Let It Be naked tracks, which are very much different historical artifacts than the originals, and there is context that needs to be understood there, and yeah, that nuance will get lost as time goes by, and people will miss out on the detail of you couldn't have stereo when the Beatles first released their first singles, but people will forget those little nuances.
Yeah.
So as we approach the end of our discussion here, I wanted to see if you guys could summarize the Beatles using one word, and if you could, which word would you choose?
For me, I've thought about it before a bit. It would just be iconic, because I do think, kind of similar to what we were just saying a moment ago, in 500 years' time, in 1,000 years' time, how much of the culture we listen to now, the music we listen to now, will survive? Because recorded music is barely 100 years old, and it already feels like we have a glut of it. But I do think the Beatles will be, perhaps, give it enough time, maybe the only cultural musical artifact that survives of the 20th century, and I'm fine with that. But I think that would define them as iconic.
Yeah, and actually, I think I would circle back to one of the first questions that you asked, Jack, about what defined them the most, or what changed the most throughout the arc of their time. And so my word would be fearless, just because I think part of what made them so iconic was just the way that they just never stopped pushing boundaries, and never stopped defying conventions and trying new things, and setting new precedents with every single release that they put out. I think, well, curious would be a runner-up word for me, just because they had such curiosity about what was possible and what they could make, and they always pursued it, even when there were pressures not to. But yeah, fearless. I think I'll stick with that one.
Yeah, Josh, that's cool, huh? Fearless. Yeah, but to me, it's really friends, because everyone, we have a lot of fans, but to me, it's really times if you can have a really great friends, count by both hands, that's amazing, And to me, those guys just met in the right place, right time, maybe, and just kept continue to make a life together as a musician and make music. I think that's almost impossible. Impossible means very, very rare. Just like David said, that's probably that's long time to, as a amazing example of 4 people made music, So to me, friends, that's the first. Otherwise, sometimes people say, who's the best one from Beatles? To me, it's just the band. It's, that it's strong, And then, of course, everybody favorite, Paul's writing is great. But to me, Paul's writing also influenced by John Lennon. And speaking writing, to me, strongest to me, maybe George, because he doesn't get opinion from other people. To me, it seems like he's just write his own thing. He came up with his own idea, and everybody follows him instead of telling him what to do. That's my thought.
So, Josh, what are you up to now? Are you involved in any projects coming out?
Oh, yeah. So I just finished the production of a full-length album with my band, The Bygones, that I've just started recently. We are a indie folk duo with tints of jazz and country music. Allison Young is the other member of that band. And we're going to be releasing our album next March, and we're going to be touring the US in April and May of next year. So right now we're just getting ready for all the run-up to that, getting the final production together and working on a PR campaign and things like that. So yeah, getting the Bygones off the ground is my project, and hopefully we'll be announcing more tour dates in the US and elsewhere later next year.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to go to one of your shows if you're playing in New York.
Oh, thanks, man.
Me too. Yeah, I love to go to a show. Yeah, man.
And Tomo, how about you? What projects are you involved in right now?
Sure, yeah. Right now, I'm playing my own band with Oznoy, Will Lee, and Sean Pelton. This is the second time at Beta End, New York City, and then this is going to be December 7th and Thursday night. I'm so excited. And I just came back from China. This is crazy, too. 4 years ago, somebody said, you have a lot of fans in China. I have no idea. But once you go there, they have their own thing. They have their own, YouTube, everything own thing. So you don't know till you get there. And that was surprising. I mean, that was so amazing that I played the first time at the Blue Note in Shanghai. First night, I had 450 people. Second night, 350 people. And the longest sign ever I have done. And that was amazing. So that's like next one. Next year, I'm going to do a China tour. Shanghai, Hong Kong, Beijing, and one more city. And then maybe Japan. And then I'm writing instrumental. This is really interesting too. I work with an arranger who works with Yoasobi. He's one of my fans, I found out. So I write a song, but I don't write a song. This is unique too. I made a video and he listened to it without writing. He arranged it. Just like a Beatles in a way. Just because I learned this. He's a great arranger. And I asked him, how do you get music from a singer? He said, just singing with the chords. That's it. No sheet. And that's my new way to work with him, because writing. So that way, it's like free. And he take a different way than I write. Sometimes he, confused, but then that's good. One part I play minor, he plays dominant, and sounds great. Something like that. So it's several different projects, and I'm still teaching at the Berkeley, 30th year. Amazing. Nice, still going.
Awesome. David, how about you? Are you working on any new projects at the moment? Please tell me some new videos are on the way, because I'm really excited to see your new videos.
Yeah, there's ton. I've kind of been trying to ramp up videos a bit recently, experimenting with doing twice a week, which has been quite costly on my energy, but it's been great for the channel. So yeah, it's hard to list how many I've got. One that I'm excited for is looking at how most countries in the world don't use A, B, C, D, E, F, G for their notes, and instead use do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si. And that's something I never really thought about, but actually I think a lot of people in English-speaking countries don't realize. So that's a video that's coming up. And also, sort of the project that I've been dragging along for the last couple of years is some original songs that I'm planning on releasing in the first part of next year, which would be the first time I've sort of done original songs since I started the channel. So kind of excited to see what the response is to that.
That's awesome. Are those going to be just instrumentals, or will they feature your vocals as well?
They've got vocals as well. So I started music as a songwriter and then somehow went on a whole journey, and then I wound up back here again. So yeah, it's been overdue to do some actual songwriting, but I've been sitting on these songs for a few years now, and I'm ready to release them.
That's awesome, man. I can't wait to hear them.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I am the biggest fan of all three of you, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you again.
Thanks, Jack.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's nice to meet all of you guys.
Yeah, you guys too. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much,
Bye.
guys. Bye.